So in today's lesson, we're looking at the marking out process for the sides of the toolbox. In a previous lesson, we marked our two pieces of timber up with the face side and face edge symbol, and we've marked them both as right side and left side appropriately. Now, if we have a look at the working drawing, it's important that we realise that the right side and left side are mirror images. Okay, it's not the exact same part cut twice. If I was to do that, say for example, I was to cut the right side twice, as it's shown here in the working drawing, when I come to line these up, the stopped housing joint is going to be on opposite ends of the assembly, and obviously that's not going to work. So it's important that we mark out the right side as we see it here in the drawing, and we mark out the left side as we see it here in the drawing. So to begin with today, we will mark out the right side, and we can see here on the working drawing that the stopped housing joint is 50 millimeters from the right hand edge. So that's the first thing we'll begin to mark out today. So I can put my left side out of the way for just now. I take a steel rule and my tri-square, and I can begin to mark out the stopped housing joint. So on the right hand edge of the right side, my steel rule is flush against the edge, and I'm making a dot close to the edge at 50 millimeters, like so. Then take my tri-square, flush against the face edge, and square this line across the face side, like so. So 50 millimeters in from the right hand side, I have this line. Again, going back to our working drawing, we can see the width of the stopped housing joint is 12 millimeters. Now I could measure that, I could measure 12 millimeters from the line that I've just marked, or I could use my right hand edge as a datum and measure 62 millimeters. But what I will do instead, similar to the marking out process for the end piece where I use my MDF base, I'm instead going to use the insert here, okay, because I know that it's the insert that it's going to form the stopped housing joint with my side piece here. So I'm going to take the insert, I'm going to line that up on the line I've just marked at 50 millimeters, and I will use the thickness of this piece of material to mark out the width of the joint. Okay, so rather than assume that this material has been prepared at 12 millimeters, I'm just going to use it as it is, and then any imperfections in the timber are being transferred directly onto this joint, and the exact width of this timber is going to be the exact width of the joint that I mark out. So I have the line here at 50 millimeters. All I need to do is place the insert right on that line and bring my pencil and make a small dot on the edge of the timber there to mark out the width of that joint. So I've not used the insert as a tri-square, I've not drawn the line the whole way across, all I've done is mark the thickness of the material. So I can now take my tri-square against the face edge and square this line across the timber, like so. I now square these lines onto the edge. Now, we're looking at our right side here. We have our face side and our face edge on the bottom. The two lines I'm going to square across are going to be on this opposite edge here, so they would be on the top of this particular piece of timber. So I can take my tri-square against the face side, bring it up to the lines I have marked on my face side, and square them down onto this edge, like so. So I have the two lines on my face side, and I've squared them onto the opposite edge as well. If we again go back to our working drawing, we can see here in the plan view that the depth of the stopped housing joint is 9 millimeters. So I can take my marking gauge, I can set my marking gauge to 9 millimeters, so I'll loosen off the thumb screw, slide the stock up and down with my thumb, and slide the stock up so that I've got a distance of 9 millimeters between the spur and the stock, remembering to keep my steel rule on the sharp point of the spur, not against the stem. So tighten that up and just double check that it didn't move. Might move slightly, give it a small tap on the bench here. And I am happy that that is on 9mm, so I'll give it that final little twist to make sure it's nice and tight. So with this set at 9mm, I can use my marking gauge against the face side here to score the depth between the two lines I've just marked onto this edge. So I could put this into the vise if I wish, but for just now I'm happy enough just holding it in my hands and scoring that line across there to mark the depth, like so. If we again go back to our working drawing, as this is a stopped housing joint, the joint's not going to go the whole way across the timber. And if we look here on the right hand side of the working drawing, we can see we'll get a dimension of 20mm. So the edge of this joint is 20mm from the bottom edge of the timber. So that's going to involve setting my marking gauge again to 20mm. So I've loosened off the stock and I can slide this now to 20mm like so. Tighten the thumb screw and double check that it didn't move. I'm happy that's on 20. Against the face edge of the timber, and I'm going to score this line on the face side between my two pencil lines. Like so. I can pencil that line in. And now everything from this line to the edge is waste, just as everything above this edge is also waste. So I can score this out. It's my pencil, mark it out as waste. And everything in here is also waste. So for the right side, I've now fully marked out the stopped housing joint. Okay? If we go back to the working drawing, as I mentioned in our previous lesson, the sides and the ends are going to be joined using dowel joints. And we can see we've got centres marked out here on the end of the timber for the dowel joints. So we're going to mark these centres out on the side piece in this lesson, and we'll be able to use these centres once they've been drilled to mark out the centres on the end piece. Okay, you remember from our previous lesson that we didn't mark the centres for the dowel joints on the end. Instead, we're going to use the centres that we create here and transfer them over later using dowel pins. So looking at the end elevation of the right side, we can see that we've got a distance of 9mm to find that centre line across the end grain, and then 20mm from the edge to find the centre of each hole to be drilled. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set my marking gauge to 9mm, as we had before. So we'll slide the stock up to 9mm there. Tighten up the thumb screw. Just double check that it didn't move slightly. We tap on the bench. Still slightly too high. Happy with that, that's on 9. And I want to score a line across the end grain on both sides of this part of timber, this piece of timber. So for this, I'm going to secure it in the bench vise, like so. I'm going to use my marking gauge against the face side, which I know is this side here, so that's where the stock of the tool will rest against, and I can use both hands to help guide this spur across the end grain of timber, like so. Not going to pencil this in just now. I'll pencil it in once I've marked out the centres. I'm going to turn it round in the vise, mark out the opposite end grain. Again, my face side is here, hasn't moved, so the stock of the marking gauge will stay on that side. Again, guide the spur across the end grain to mark out that line there, 9mm in. As we saw on the working drawing, we'll just have a quick look back at this again. We can see that we've got a distance of 20mm in from the edge to find the centre for each dowel. So keeping my timber where it is in the bench vise, I'm going to hold my steel rule flush against the end, and I'm going to make a dot here at 20mm, like so. Try square against the face side, and I can square that across the end grain, like so. What I can now do is pencil across the line that I marked with a marking gauge to show the centre there, which I will can centre punch for the dowel joint. Do the same from the opposite edge. So steel rule flush against the end, a dot at 20mm, try square against the face side, nice and tight, square that line across, and then pencil across there to find the centre. So I've now marked two centres on the end grain. I'll be able to either use a centre punch or a bradawl to mark those centres properly in order for them to be drilled. So I'm now going to do the same thing on the opposite end here. So with these centres marked, I'll now take a bradawl and I'll just prepare those centres to be drilled. So lining up the bradawl on that mark, and I can just twist the bradawl in position to mark the centre for both of these, and then turn this round and do the same. Put that in position. And I've now fully prepared these to be drilled. So this is a fully marked out right side, where the stopped housing joint is on the right hand side of the timber, 50mm from the edge, with a depth of 9, and stopped 20mm from the bottom edge, in this case our face edge. And we've marked out the two centres on each end to be drilled to allow the dowel joints to join the sides with the end pieces. So if we have a look at our working drawing, we can see that the dimensions remain the same for the left side. All that changes is that our stopped housing joint is measured in from the left hand side of the timber rather than the right. Okay, as I said at the start of the lesson, these two parts are not identical, they are mirror images of each other to allow them to fit the insert between them when we assemble them. So if I take my left side, I'm going to mark this up in the same way. However, as I just said, the housing joint is going to be on the left hand side of the timber. So I've now marked out the left side as a mirror image of the right side. As you can see here, stopped housing joint with the exact same dimensions, a depth of 9, stopped 20mm below the bottom edge, 50mm from the left hand edge. Okay, exact same dimensions as it was on the right, however, as we said, over here on the left hand side. We've marked out the centres for the dowel joints on the end grains as well. And just to prove the point, if we bring these pieces of timber together with the face edges towards the bottom, the joints line up in the same position. Okay, so it is really important that we don't end up marking out the same side twice, because they will not match up, they will not align when we put them together to be assembled.
So when we come to assemble the sides of the toolbox, the insert is the component which is going to be joined between the two stopped housing joints of the left and the right side. So we're currently looking at the working drawing for the insert. We can see we've got an overall dimension of 122 in length and 90 in height, and it's important that we get the insert in the correct orientation before we begin to mark this out. okay? Because if we mark out the waste areas in the wrong corners, then obviously we'll not be able to assemble the parts properly. So as you can see, we have a 9mm dimension, which is stepped in from the right and left hand edges. And that 9mm corresponds with the depth of 9mm, which we marked on the stopped housing joints for the left and right side. We also have a dimension here of 20mm, and that 20mm corresponds to the stop of 20mm, which we marked on the left and right sides as well, when we stopped at 20mm from the edge of the piece of timber. So what we're going to have a look at now is how to mark out the insert with these dimensions so that we can mark out the waste areas properly for cutting.
So we'll just check that the insert has been labelled the correct way. So we want 122 across, like we have here, and 90 top to bottom. So 122 left and right, and 90 top to bottom. So this is the correct orientation for the insert. So we know from the working drawing that we have 9mm in from the right and left hand edges. So that's what we can mark first. We'll take our steel rule, hold it against the left edge of the insert, and make a dot at 9mm. Sharper your pencil, the better. Like so. Square that across, try square against the face edge. Square that across timber, across the face side. Like so. And for the purpose of this particular part, we want this squared round onto the opposite edge and the opposite side as well. So, just for the ease of this, we'll square it round on all sides, all edges. Like so. And press here. And we'll do the same from the right hand edge, 9mm squared all the way around with the tri-square. Okay, so we now have the 9mm dimension from both edges, the left and the right. We now need to drop down the 20mm dimension from this top edge. And because we'll be running parallel with the grain here, we will use our marking gauge. So we'll loosen off the stock of the marking gauge and set the distance between the spur and the stock to 20mm, just like we did earlier for the stopped housing joint on the side. So just double check it hasn't moved. I'm happy that that is there on 20mm. And I can hold this against the face edge and score the depth of 20 from the end to my line there at 9mm. I can do it across the end grain as well, like so. In fact, this is probably best done in the vise, I would suggest. I'm going to move this into the vise just now. Hold this against the edge there, square it across the end grain, and down onto the opposite side as well, opposite side like that. I pencil these in. So, that area here is going to become waste, and that will be the bit that will allow this insert to fit within these stopped housing joints. So I can just mark this all out as waste, like so. And that can be removed later. So just need to repeat that process on the opposite end. So again, we put this into our vise, holding the marking gauge against the face edge, and I can score this 20mm line onto the timber. like so. Into these lines in. And mark out the waste area. So we've now fully marked out the waste areas on the insert here, which will allow the insert to slot into the stopped housing joint that we've cut on the left and right hand sides. So I'll just bring those back in, the left side and the right side, like we have here. So the way this will work is we'll have a right side, we'll have the left side, and the insert will slot in between the two. So once we remove the waste areas from the sides, and the insert will have two stopped housing joints to hold these all together. So in our next lesson, we will look at how to prepare the blank for turning for the handle of the toolbox.